So for my, I guess, brief bio, started studying this stuff at like the age of 14 just for fun. It really made no sense to me at all until I was probably 19 or 20. And then it made a little bit of sense then, and now I'm 28. It makes a little bit more sense now. And then probably when I'm 50 or 100 or whatever, it'll make a little bit more sense. So how I put this presentation together, it's not just a bunch of stuff that I read in a book. It's not just me taking text and putting it in here and like telling it to you. It's basically coming out of my own experience, because I earn a living basically living these principles, so earning money, helping people using these philosophies in a spiritual sense or a philosophical sense or a religious sense. But I guess in a practical application, I practiced Taoist martial arts for the last couple of years. Some of the more esoteric forms that are kind of weird and not really well known in the West. And then also I've been practicing Chinese herbalism for probably 8 years now. So that's sort of what I do for a living. I'm an herbalist, I own my own company, have that whole thing, and I have a YouTube channel with like 400 and some odd videos basically just talking about these sorts of philosophies. So it's kind of what I live and breathe. So for me to like put together a 1 hour presentation on Taoism was a bit of a challenge because there's just literally so much. But at the same time, if we were really to talk about Taoism, I would just get up here for an hour and we would just stare at each other. Because Taoism is not really about talking, it's not about thinking, it's about experience and feeling. Which is, again, why it's so opposite to us in the West, because we're all about thinking, we're all about rational, and we sort of tune out and push away our emotions, our instincts, our intuition, our creativity. So, that being said, what we're going to do today is get a vision of the profundity within the simplicity of the principles of Taoism. We're going to get a basic and clear understanding of the major tenets and principles of Taoism, and then demystify, clarify, and ground our perception in view of this philosophy. Now, I apologize in advance if there's any typos in my presentation. Doing this sort of thing is not really my strong suit. I'm more of just a talker rather than a writer, so there'll probably be all manner of typos in there. So that's our purpose today, and it's going to be sort of experiential in that we'll get an illustration of the principle, but also an application for how we can relate it to the here and now, so it's not this weird, lofty sort of thing. Because I looked over the text that you guys had on Taoism, and it was like, what, like 5 pages or something? It was actually pretty decent, because there was some pretty esoteric stuff that whoever wrote that, like, tied in, because there was one person they mentioned that lived to be 250, the Li King Yuan. You mentioned that, and that's actually a pretty legit guy. There's actually another guy in China right now who's like 130, and he's like a national living treasure in China. But what's funny about this guy, he's 130, but you would think he was like 60, and he smokes, and he drinks, and he eats like all of the wrong foods, but he's 130, but is a kung fu master, so he could probably beat all of us up at the same time without even trying, but he's 130. But he's been studying Taoism since he was like 16. So this whole thing about Li King Yuan, which it talked about, it's funny because he was really into a few set of herbs as his like major longevity thing, and I actually sell those and take those herbs. So it was kind of a cool thing to see. So anyways, these are the major principles that we'll cover. We'll sort of get a big bird's eye point of view for looking at the archetype or the story of the quintessential Taoist master, which we've all seen, like Star Wars. We've seen Yoda, we've seen maybe some kung fu movies. And these images and archetypes were pulled out of Taoism and put into that. Like in Star Wars, the Force and Yoda and Obi-Wan and all of their philosophy, George Lucas basically just said, oh, let me take Taoism and like put it in the movie. And then the next principle we'll look at the wisdom and power of simplicity. And then these major backbone integral components of Taoist thought, which is the unity of man and nature. And then water as the greatest teacher. And then finally we'll sort of look at the 5 elements or the 5 phases, which to the Taoist is kind of like our equivalent of the modern periodic table of elements, where we understand that, oh, all matter is made up of this combination of elements. So if we understand the elements, we can understand the matter. To the Taoists, they see everything through these 5 elements. And they say, well, everything is made up of these 5 elements, so I can understand people, I can understand situations, and I understand all manner of the manifestations of reality through these 5 elements. And I can tell you, just from a practitioner's point of view, sometimes I can just have a brief conversation with someone and know exactly what's going on with their organs and say, Did this happen to you when you were a kid? Do you have this belief? Do you have this feeling? Do you have this thought? And then people are like, what? Wow. How did you know that? It's because if you use these 5 elements and you know, okay, well, this organ has this emotion, it's associated with this element, you can see all of the correlations. I know that probably doesn't make any sense, but it will make more sense as we go on. And then finally, we'll look at Wu Wei, or the action of no action. Because this is one of the things that everyone thinks is sort of like just being lazy, or sort of just being passive and like sitting on a couch all day. Like people think that's what Taoism is all about. Because we're trained to really value our initiative, our goals, our dreams, our aspirations. That's part of our major drive. I mean, we're in college right now. Why? Because we want to get a degree, we want to get a better job, we want to make more money, we probably want to have a family, we want to have kids, we want to be successful. But then we read Taoism and it's like, be passive, don't have desires, don't use action, don't force things. And you're like, wait, this makes no sense. But we're going to see that's not really what it's about at all. So the illustration of the quintessential Taoist master. And this is both an archetype and a real literal thing, meaning there are people that live and embody this idea. So we have this image of the quintessential Taoist master, and we all probably imagine just an old bearded guy, or this old bearded Chinese man. And he happens to be a master of multiple forms of Chinese martial arts, hard style, soft style, internal, external, as well as medicine and healing and acupuncture and herbalism and cooking and calligraphy and poetry and art and music and meditation, qigong, philosophy, spirituality. All of that sounds like a lot. It sounds like, how could one person ever possibly master all of these things at the same time? And really to our thing, if we were to say, okay, here's your life's purpose, you need to master all of these things, we're all probably going to feel pretty overwhelmed, like there's just no way. So how can one person possibly do this? Well, the answer is quite simple in that they haven't actually mastered all of these different areas. And what that means is our first major diversion from the way we see things versus the way a Taoist sees things. So to us, we think all of these are separate things, meaning if we want to learn music, we got to go over here. If we want to learn martial arts, we need to go over here. And all these things are separate little components. Much in the same way, we view ourselves as separate components. Our mind is over here, our emotions are over there, our spirituality is over here, our religion's over there. We're sort of very compartmentalized, and our external world mirrors that oftentimes. But to the Taoist master, he realizes, wait, actually these are all the same thing because it's all a reflection of me. It's all a reflection of my state of consciousness. Or if I want to master these areas, I have to master myself first. So what that means is they master a few basic principles and then apply them to all these different areas. So right now, if we talk about feng shui, or we talk about tai chi, we talk about martial arts, we talk about Chinese herbalism, Chinese medicine, we think they're all different. But they're all actually the same because they all have the same exact theoretical foundations. They all have the same exact philosophies. So that's why a quintessential Taoist master would hit all of these different areas, is because it allows them to study the principles in a different way. So even though it looks like they're doing different things, in their mind, it's the same exact thing. And again, this usually baffles us because we think of everything as separate. We're separate from the environment. We're separate from each other. Our mind is separate from our body. All of these things are embedded philosophical assumptions in our society, in our culture, in our education system, etc. So we can ask ourselves, well, why does this happen? And it's not because it is necessarily true or false. It's more so just the way we're trained to look at things. It's the way our perception is. Because as we were saying earlier, we tend to ignore constants. We tend to ignore things kind of like a fish in water. So one of the main reasons, and honestly, we could do a whole 12-hour presentation on the reasons of this, but one of the main reasons for this context is we tend to focus on the figure and then ignore the background or the constant or the process that supports it or allows it to come into being. In the same way, we can look at these images and get an illustration or an idea of this principle. Now, we see the first image here, and some of us probably see 4 people. Some of us probably see like what looks like chess pieces. And then the one below, some of us probably see the face of a woman, while we can see also the outline of a guy playing the saxophone. And then on the other side, we have the quintessential sort of vase subject, or we have two faces. And then at the bottom, is that ocean waves? Is that 2 birds' heads? Is that a yin-yang symbol? And really, all of these things, it's not that they're one or the other. They're actually both at the same time, depending on how you look at it. So that's really the major departure that Taoism takes us. In our system, we are based on Aristotelian logic, which says that things are either A or not A. End of story. But the Taoism, they can be A and not A at the same time, and be neither at the same time, which is very, kind of a logical head trip. So again, that's one of the major reasons why we tend to ignore this underlying principle and these underlying processes. So leading into this, we're talking about this idea of separation, and how to the Taoists it's completely absurd, because their whole thing is about the unity of man and nature, meaning that nature and us, we're all one and the same thing. And I don't mean in kind of like the hippie sense where we're all going to like bust out a drum circle and like pass around the water pipe and like chant hymns and all that sort of thing. It's not really like that at all. It's something much deeper and more profound. So if our whole thing is we're based on the separation of everything, why would someone care about the unity of man and nature? Why is this important and useful and at all applicable or relevant to us today? It's because to the Taoists, nature is obviously older, wiser, healthier, and more vital than we are. Meaning we don't really know how old the planet is. We can have estimations, but our estimations always change based on the technology that we have. So we don't really know, because we might invent some new technology that allows us to measure even more, and we might discover who knows what. So to the Taoists, they utilize what I'll call this modern principle of modeling, which comes out of psychology or behavioral analysis, and it's basically like, in a simple term, if you want to be a millionaire, you should study the habits and the beliefs and the actions of people who are millionaires. If you want to weigh 150 pounds, or you want to have your ideal weight, you should study people who achieve their ideal weight. It's kind of this simple way. So to the Taoists, they want to be old, they want to have longevity, they want to have health, they want to have spiritual insight and cultivation. Well, where's the best example of that? To the Taoists, and you got to think back to the culture they were in. They didn't have all of our modern stuff. They lived off the land. They were basically agrarian sort of cultures. So to them, the best example they can have, well, nature. Nature is older, it's wiser, it's healthier, it's more vital. So what the Taoists would do is they would basically just sit in nature and observe things, observe principles, and say, if this is true for nature, maybe it's true inside of me. And that's how these ideas came about. So that's one sort of practical application of this idea of the unity of man and nature, is that it allows the Taoists to really model the techniques and traits that they want to embody. And again, it's another one of these things that makes total sense. It's right in front of us all the time, and it's kind of obvious, and it's simple, but for those reasons, we just ignore it. We have in our vernacular, oh, it's too good to be true, it's too simple to be true, oh, that's so obvious. It's like, yeah, well, why is that bad? It's because we tend to think complex is better, harder is better. But to the Taoists, it's the total opposite. They're about simple and easy. They're about, well, if I can get from point A to point B and row my boat, sure, that's one option. But if I can get from point A to point B and just throw up a sail and let the wind push me, why would I not do that? So Taoism is, in many ways, kind of the lazy man's route. Because for me, that was what was most attractive as well. I can get more done with less work. I can just not do things and things will take care of itself, meaning I can be naturally lazier but get more done, meaning I can work 2 hours a week but be more productive than if I worked 40 hours a week. That's possible. I mean, to me, that's why it's obvious and simple. It's like, well, why would you not want that? Why would you not want easier and simpler? Why would you choose more complex and hard and stressed over more simple? So again, in this principle is just like the wind and sailing, or just like flowing with the stream and the current rather than going against them. Now, one obvious thing that could come up is that, well, isn't that passive? What about my dreams? What about my goals? What about the things that I want? Well, it's not that you just let the wind guide you wherever it wants to go. No, you take the wind and you sort of guide it to where you want to go. You use its natural energy or its natural sort of motivation to take you where you want to go. So it's not this passive sort of lazy thing where you just jump in the river and just who cares where I end up. No, you can still be very driven and very goal-oriented and still make things happen, but just going with the stream and going with the current rather than fighting against it. So going further into this idea of the unity of man and nature, we're going to get a little probably hippie and new agey for a second, but to illustrate this point, is that to the Taoist, we are inherently nature. We are the same process. You know, the same process that grows our hair grows our crops. Into Taoism, in Taoist texts, they say a lot of images and metaphors and allegories to sort of clouds and water and wind and these sorts of natural phenomena. And that's not just for the illustration purposes. They actually believe that the same process that makes water flow on the earth, meaning that makes water flow in rivers, makes blood circulate in our body. They're saying it's the same exact energy. So for them, we are nature. We came from the earth. We are nourished by it. All of our food comes out of it. And then we will eventually return to it. And then again, it's this process that grows our hair, beats our heart, digests our food, and basically runs the show while we're busy sitting here taking notes or thinking about what we're doing later today or what we have to do or whatever. So again, to the Taoists, the same process that grows our hair also grows our crops. And it's inherently some of the practical applications for this idea of the unity of man and nature. In a literal sense, not in some sort of like take a bunch of drugs and trip out in the woods sort of sense, but in a real here and now sort of sense. So far we've covered some things that can seem really simple, really obvious, really easy. You've read some text. A lot of it was just kind of boring because it was so simple and so obvious. But therein lies the real profundity, meaning Lao Tzu said, truthful words are not beautiful, beautiful words are not truthful. And we can take that and notice that how simple and bare bones these texts were, and how we usually think, oh, well, it's too simple to be true, it's too easy to be true. But to the Taoists, they say, if it's too complex, if it's too convoluted, it's really not true. And one thing we can think about is, as a practical example, like let's say we wanted to learn how to block a punch. What our modern approach is, well, we need to read all of the books about blocking a punch. We need to learn the system of the system and the lineage and the history of the lineage and the person that came up with it and their biography and their teacher's biography and the dates and the forms, and we need to memorize all of this stuff. And then we need to study with 50 different teachers, learn all of their different blocks. But in reality, someone can still walk up to you and punch you in the face because you still don't know how to block a punch. So really the practical application isn't accumulating all of this head knowledge and learning all of this stuff and memorizing it, because it doesn't help you unless you have that reflex in your body to basically block and get out of the way when someone punches you without thinking about it. So to the Taoists, that's really the profound depth of simplicity. Now we can look at two examples to sort of take this even further. One is the example of the bamboo versus the oak tree. Because remember earlier we're talking about, well, the Taoist is just sort of chilling in nature, not really doing anything, just observing and learning. So let's say he's sitting out in nature and there comes a huge windstorm. And he sees the oak tree, sees the bamboo tree, and sees how they respond and handle the situation. The oak tree is likely to be destroyed. Well, why? Because it's hard and it's rigid, and it's not going to be flexible and supple with the wind, meaning the wind's going to hit it and basically knock it over. Whereas the bamboo tree is going to be very soft and supple, because if you've ever been around bamboo, you can basically just grab it and pull it down on the ground and it'll whip right back up, because it's very soft and supple and flexible. So to us, we just think, who cares about trees? Like, I don't care about an oak tree, whatever, you know? But to the Taoists, they say, wow, the oak tree is hard and rigid, and it doesn't have longevity. The bamboo tree is soft and supple, and it just survived this cataclysm or just survived this windstorm, so it has longevity. If I want longevity, maybe I should be soft and supple. Then they say, well, where in my life could I be more soft and supple? Well, obviously I can do Tai Chi, I can do Qigong, I can do yoga, I can become physically softer, but emotionally, where in my life could I be more soft and supple? And that's how sort of the Taoist thought process. But to us, we say, who cares about trees? But to them, they say, oh my God, I just learned something really masterful. And then also this whole thing about being like water. And we could say that Taoism came from water, or that water embodies a lot of Taoist principles. Kind of one and the same thing. But really to a Taoist, the ideal state for our mental well-being, for our emotional, physical, and spiritual states would be illustrated in a smooth flowing body of water. Now this is at the same time kind of esoteric and weird, but also so obvious it's ridiculous. because we're obviously 70 to 85% water. And if we look at ourselves, what are we? We're a series of tubes that which water flows. Water in different forms, meaning our blood, our lymph, our cerebrospinal fluid, our digestive fluid, our nerve impulses, which isn't really a fluid, but it's still flowing through a tube, and then our hormonal secretions, on and on and on. So literally, we can see, well, Taoism's really into water, but we are mostly water. So where's the connection? A couple different ways. First is there's kind of this obvious thing, which, has anyone ever just been around a body of water and felt chilled out? Like whether you people just go sit by the ocean. Not that we live by the ocean, but let's say you live on the coast, you go sit by the ocean. You see people just sitting there, just chilling for hours, just by the ocean. Or for us, we have rivers, we have lakes, we have streams. We all sort of just feel this natural calming sensation. So again, to the Taoists, they're like, I feel something by this water. There must be something here. What is this principle? Oh, the water is smooth and flowing. Maybe if I'm smooth and flowing, I can take this chill feeling that I'm getting and really embody it and take it further. And then another way we can sort of illustrate this is just to imagine that we're just holding a bowl of water that's just full to the brim. If you've ever done this, you know that you have to walk like really slow and really smooth. And if you move like that, what happens? The water goes everywhere. But the way we tend to move is we just sort of throw our bodies around. We sit down in our car, we're just basically, it's like plopping down. Or we sit on a couch, we just throw ourselves around. Even when we exercise, people are running, they're beating themselves on the ground, or all of our physical activities are typically very jarring to the body, which to the Taoists doesn't really align up with the principle of smooth flowing water. Because we look at, okay, we are mostly water. We are a series of tubes through which water flows. Okay, so the way we move could obviously affect the circulation and the movement of that water, which we can illustrate and understand by just imagining that we were holding sort of a bucket full of water. Because by having that imagery, we can sort of move more fluidly and naturally. And for me, this is something that I learned from my own body, from learning Qigong, from learning martial arts, in that if you're very hard and rigid, or you move erratically or chaotically, you just basically defeat yourself, because a good opponent will say, boom, there's the weakness, and you're done. But if you move slow and fluid, or you move like this body of water, people can't really break you down that way because you're soft and supple. Someone comes at you, automatically just adjust and redirect the energy. So in a physical sense, this is true, but also we can apply it in kind of an energetic sense or a psychological sense. Because to the Taoist, they're talking about being calm, being peaceful, being still, right? It's in all the texts. Well, that is akin and equated to this smooth flowing body of water. But when we're very stressed, we're very jagged, we're very chaotic in our emotions and our thoughts, which we're human beings, so that's most of the time. To the Taoist, not only is our energy flow affected, but the circulation of our fluids is affected. And to illustrate and understand that, it's basically like if you were to go up to a body of water, take a big rock and just dump it in, and the water just disperses and shoots everywhere. To the Taoist, that's what happens when we're very stressed and chaotic. Because it's in a sort of esoteric sense, that's what's happening, is energy is being scattered. But also in a literal sense, what are we? We're a series of tubes. So if you have all this muscle tension, what's going to happen to your blood circulation? It's going to be constricted. So that's obviously going to undermine your health. You're going to feel tired. You're going to feel lethargic. Your food's not going to digest as well. And your health and your whole state of being is going to be undermined. So that's a few ways in which this sort of idea as water as the greatest teacher can be applicable and understood in the here and now. Does that make sense to anyone, or is that pretty weird? You can be honest. If you think it's weird, I don't care. I'm not going to get mad. So our next principle is this idea of the relativity of perception. Because like right now, if we were to take out a piece of paper and say, all right, describe this room, or describe your thoughts of this presentation so far, everyone's going to have something different. I'm going to have something different, you're going to have something different. So then, which is true? Well, they're all true and they're all false because of this principle. And it's kind of funny that, so did you guys actually read the Tao text, or just that statement?
Just what was in the text. I brought in just a few other passages, but not much.
So ironically, the first line in the Tao Te Ching is, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Which is basically saying that what I'm about to write a book about, you can't write a book about. It's kind of... So within Taoism, there's kind of this like tongue-in-cheek sort of irony, because he's basically saying, you can't talk about these concepts because they're beyond words, but I'm about to write a book about it. So we can understand that in sort of the modern terms of the map is not the territory. And this comes from a discipline called general semantics, which if anyone's really into linguistics or language and is a total nerd, they know what that is. Otherwise, you can sum it up in that. But really, like we just illustrated, everyone will have a different Tao, or everyone will have a different interpretation. So what this means to the Taoists, this whole thing about the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, is that the symbolic reality is not the real reality. And the symbol isn't the thing. Which sounds like, okay, it makes kind of sense, it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, we don't realize that. People say, oh, this song is awesome, and they're like, oh, I hate that. And then what do? We get mad, or we say, oh, that's the greatest movie ever. Someone's like, that movie was weak. I can't believe you like that. And we get all upset, we get all mad, we get all offended. Because right now we're saying, oh, well, of course the symbol isn't the thing. But then when the situation comes, we forget, oh, yeah, they're just talking. This is just their symbol. It's not the actual thing. So to use an illustration, we can say that words are like a finger pointing at the moon. So what we usually do is just like, wow, it's a nice finger. Look at that nail. Look at that cuticle. Look at that nail bed. I need a manicure. We get all obsessed with the finger, but forget to actually look at the moon, which is the whole point of the finger. So in the same way, the menu isn't the meal. You know, you can read a recipe. You could spend 30 years researching food and nutrition, but you'll never be nourished because statistics and data don't nourish you because they're not the actual thing. And then the word water will never quench our thirst. I could do a 6-hour presentation on the whole ins and outs of water. At the end of the day, we'll all still be thirsty because the symbols about the thing aren't the actual thing. And you can't go out in nature and harvest an inch. And likewise, you can't take an inch and build a house because those are just symbols that we invented. And they're useful, they're helpful, but also inherently limiting because we confuse them for the actual thing. Meaning we think money is more important than actual wealth. Forgetting that money is a symbol of wealth. Money is a representation. Money is inherently empty and meaningless other than the value and the meaning that we give it. It's essentially just a piece of paper. But we give it all of this stuff, which, yeah, has use and practicality, but it's not the actual thing. So some illustrations and examples of this. You know, if we were to all witness the same event and then all recount our event in a paragraph or less, probably going to get strikingly different interpretations. And sometimes it can be so distinct to say, did you even see the same thing? Like you and your friend might watch the same movie and you have one interpretation, they have another, and you're like, were we even watching the same thing? Like, where were you? And it's funny too, because sometimes I'll do videos. People will post comments, and I'm like, did you even watch it? Like, do you even have any idea, or are you just watching something else? And likewise, right now, if I were to wheel in a bunch of food, give everyone the identical recipe, the identical ingredients, the identical equipment, the identical amount of time, and say, here, cook this. Odds are, and I'll bet a lot of money, that we're going to get highly different outcomes. We're going to get some stuff that's really good. We're going to get some stuff that's horrible. And we're going to get all sorts of permutations in between. Because to the Taoist, it's not really about the recipe. It's not about the equipment. It's not about the symbol. It's, again, going back to the Taoist Master. It's about our understanding of the principles. Because it's just like, you know, people get really into music, and they want to ask a great musician, well, what do you play? What kind of piano? What kind of guitar? But at the end of the day, you could take, you know, a great musician, give them a piece of crap instrument, and they'll sound better than all of us, most likely. Because it's not about the instrument. It's not about the thing. It's about the non-physical sort of understanding that they have for the principles. So this is the next major principle, which if we can understand this, then you can understand so many different aspects of life as far as psychological health, spiritual health, physical health, emotional health, and then whether that's in a traditional sense or even a holistic, more esoteric sense. And I say that because these two sentences, which I just noticed I didn't capitalize one or the other, but whatever. These two sentences basically are the foundational basis for Chinese medicine. The original Chinese text at the very beginning says, where there's movement and free flow, there's health. Where there's blockage, stagnation, fixation, there's dis-ease. And this concept is so profound that I basically taught an 8-hour workshop on these two sentences, and we just took it through all these different permutations. So we can look at that and say, yeah, whoop-de-doo, it's two sentences. But contained within that, there's profound depth. So let's look a little bit at how this is true and how this can be true both in the external world. We can go out in nature and say, oh, yeah, that's true. We can look at our physical body and say, wow, that's true. We can look at our emotional mind or our psychological state and say, wow, that's true too. So again, as I said, the justice principle alone can be extremely life-changing because it underlies many other Taoist techniques in schools of thought, whether that's medicine or martial arts or healing or herbalism or dietitian or whatever. And because of that, this principle can be applied to many areas of life. So let's look at some examples of how this is applicable. So as I mentioned, we can see this in nature, we can see this in our physical body, we can see this in our mind as well. So let's say we were to go out in the woods somewhere, and we were to find just a pristine river or stream. It hasn't been touched by humans. We're going to look at it, and we're going to say, you know what, let's just build a dam right here in the middle. So before this dam, everything was moving freely within that river, within that stream. The water was clean. You know, there was no sort of anaerobic or dysbiotic growth. It was a very healthy sort of ecosystem. But we build that dam, and then what happens? Two things happen. One side becomes stagnant because the water is just pooling up against the dam and basically just recycling in itself. It's not really getting that movement. So it's stagnating. So what's probably going to happen is there's going to be dysbiotic growth. It's going to be weird bacteria and viruses and mosquitoes and weird algae. And probably that ecosystem is going to start to decay. Yet on the other side, what do we have? We have basically something that's going to be atrophying because it's basically had all of its nourishment cut off. It's had the water flow cut off. So whatever organisms lived in that stream before, probably going to die because they had their nourishment cut off. So before we had free flow and movement, so we had health. We had a thriving ecosystem. Now we have blockage and stagnation, thus we have dis-ease. Now dis-ease, I don't necessarily mean a clinical sort of you have X or Y, meaning a real lack of ease. So we call that stress or tension or blockage or whatever. Hence why I put a dash in between it, dis-ease, meaning lack of ease. So the next example is we could basically look at our hand. Right now, we all have, healthy limbs. Why? Because we're getting good blood circulation. We're getting lymph and nerve impulses, and all these things are flowing in and out of our hands. If we were to basically take something and just tourniquet our hand, eventually what's going to happen? Obviously, our hand is going to atrophy. But on the other side, it's going to get really swollen because there's going to be blockage. It's the same principle and the same thing which happened with the river. Meaning right now our hand is getting nourishment, it's getting free flow, it's getting movement, so it's healthy. But if we block that, or if we even impede that through muscle tension or through stress or through repetitive motion, then our health starts to decline. And oftentimes, people talk about carpal tunnel, and people, just to go on a little bit of tangent, people think, oh, I got to get surgery, I got to do this, I got to do that, which 85% of the time people that get the surgery end up worse off than they were before because it doesn't fix the original problem. The original problem is this. There's a blockage, there's a hindrance. So all you need to do is basically get rid of the hindrance. And I can say from experience, because I used to have carpal tunnel really, really bad, meaning I couldn't do push-ups, I couldn't exercise, I couldn't work on the computer for more than a half an hour before I had to just leave because my hands were on fire. One of my friends who's a massage therapist, body worker, knocked it out in like 20 minutes. And then after that, I just adjusted my posture because carpal tunnel has nothing to do with here. Because carpal tunnel, you look at your wrists, oh, well, they're fine. Carpal tunnel's up here because we look at people's posture, 9 times out of 10, it's that. What happens when you get on the computer? That. So what happens is there's a blockage right here of circulation of nerve impulses, which causes the actual thing. Which, to the doctor, it's too simple, it's too obvious. Who cares about that? But to the Taoist, knock it out in 5 minutes. Just get in there, readjust it, get movement happening. Boom, it's done, it's gone. Because it's this simple, basic principle. And there's so many other illustrations that we could get into, but that's not really the scope and focus of our talk here. Next, we can look at our body fluids. Obviously, if our circulation in our blood is moving fine, great. Well, clinically, we understand if there's a blockage, we're going to have a problem. There's going to be a heart attack, there's going to be a stroke, there's going to be some major issue that's going to arise. So at least in that example, we can sort of see, oh yeah, well, yeah, that makes sense. But then even digestion. If our digestion starts to get sluggish or starts to get backed up, we all typically feel pretty bad. I mean, think about what happens after we massively eat ourselves into a coma on Thanksgiving. We all get really tired and sleepy. Why? Because we just threw in all of this stuff, and the system can't really handle it. So what happens? We get a little bit of stagnation, a little bit of blockage. We usually have some gas or some sort of indigestion that happens as a result. Well, why? Because there's stagnation, there's blockage, which again is the opposite of ease. It's a lack of ease. Lastly, we can look at a little bit more of an esoteric example, which would be emotional and psychological manifestations. So for an example, I did a whole hour-and-a-half talk on weight loss just using this principle. And to illustrate that, we can look at it in simply saying that if we are, let's say, 50 pounds overweight, we have the mindset and the beliefs and the actions and the physiology of someone who's 50 pounds overweight. So basically that's creating blockage, meaning we want to lose weight, we want to do this, we want to do that, but we can't because we're sort of stuck in this place. Which sure sounds funny, but if you've ever known people that try to lose weight, they basically just go back and forth. I mean, they try to do it, they can't, they want to do it, and they can't, and they just sort of go back and forth. So we can see there's blockage there, there's stagnation. So they have this physiology of the person that weighs 50 pounds overweight. What they need to do is create movement, meaning physically, obviously, to burn calories and move the body, but also movement psychologically, meaning move from the mindset and the beliefs and the psychology of someone who weighs 50 pounds overweight to the psychology and beliefs of someone who has the ideal weight, whatever that might be for the person. And again, it doesn't have to just be weight loss. It can be any area in our life. But it's just one way where we can take this principle and see, over here we have stagnation and blockage. We have a lack of ease, whether it's overweight or a health problem or emotional problem or whatever. We need to create movement there, meaning replace those beliefs and patterns and move those out and create the change that we're wanting. Does that make sense? So this principle is so crazy simple, but if we look at, even another simple example, like we all have stuff we probably should do or need to do, but we just don't do it. We kind of just put it off. Like for me, I had a huge stack of paperwork that I had to do. I just put it off for like 2 weeks, and it just was a weight. It felt horrible. I was like, I want to do it, I can't do it. I want to do it, I can't do it. And we all feel sort of this weight and kind of this annoyance. Well, what is that? It's a blockage. It's stagnation. Well, what happens when you sit down and you do it? You're like, finally. You feel better. Because why? Well, you created movement. You created free flow. Thus, you created more ease. So just another illustration of that principle. And we could go on that principle for the rest of the day and just keep doing examples and keep doing illustrations because it's so foundational and so integral to Taoist thought. So we're all on the same page up until now? Everyone feeling good? Not too many people are falling asleep, that's good. I remember when I was in school, I think probably the last 3 years of school, I just slept the whole time. Still got really good grades, but I was just out every time. I was one of those sleep learners, Which is actually, because when you go into that relaxed state, you can actually absorb information a lot more easier. So that was actually one thing I used to do a lot is basically just lay on the floor and relax and basically go into that state between sleep and waking and just listen to audiobooks and listen to things, learn things really fast. So I'm not saying you should sleep in class, but if you look at it, there are advantages.
Reassess my no sleeping in class policy.
So the next thing is pretty crucial and integral to the whole Taoist thing. That is the 5 elements, or the 5 phases, which it might get a little bit weird because we have our equivalent of the periodic table of elements, but that just applies to matter. Whereas to the Taoist, 5 elements applies to emotions, to spirituality, to psychology, to physicalness, as well as there's a color, there's a taste, there's a sound, there's a direction, there's a season. All of these things are filed in the same system. Not because they're kind of one and the same, because they see as the manifestation of the same energy or the same process. Which sounds weird, but in many ways we'll be able to illustrate it and understand it as we go on. So first, just a brief sort of introduction. As we said, it's another backbone of Taoist thought. And it came about, again, by these sages and shamans basically just sitting out in nature and just observing things. Because they didn't have jobs, they didn't have all of these social obligations. They pretty much were free to just wander around the woods all day and just do whatever they wanted. So they would just sit out and observe and say, wow, wood does this, metal does this, fire does this, wood does this, earth does this, and then sort of classify it out. And really, these elements are can be really simple and obvious, but for that reason, we have no idea. And also because they're just not in our culture, because we see them usually as sort of hokey or not really that practical or not really that useful. So again, the 5 elements are energies, are movements, or phases, are things which are believed to govern the dynamics of matter and symbolized as water, fire, wood, metal, and earth. And this is another principle that we can apply to all areas of life. And again, to the Taoist, it's kind of like, remember in the first Matrix, where after Neo gets killed, and then he wakes up and he sees in code, and he basically it's over from then on? To the Taoist, it's the same thing, meaning the Taoist doesn't see red and blue and male and female and age and color and race and sex and all these sorts of things that we see. We look at a person, we see all of that stuff. We see, oh, well, they have this much money because they're wearing that clothes and this and that. We have all of these things which we judge, which to the Taoists could really care less. They look at a person, and it's kind of like Neo seeing in code. They just see a combination of the 5 elements. Thus, they can read people like a book. And I can tell you, people that I know that are practitioners who mastered this stuff, you could meet them, say nothing to them, and in a minute and a half, they could basically read you back to yourself. Tell you things about yourself that you didn't even know and that you never told people, but they can just read it because they see these 5 elements. They can look at your face, look at your eyes, look at your tongue, look at the way you breathe, look at the way you carry your body, look at the way your voice sounds. All of these things tell them something about the 5 elements. And then they can see, ooh, there's something going on here, there's something going on there. Because again, with these 5 elements, there's an emotion, there's a color, there's a sound, there's a taste. So if you know those, you can see and know exactly what's going on. So here in this first example, we have what's called the creation cycle and the creation cycle and the destruction cycle. So on the outside, we see the arrows here basically pointing, and that is the generation and the creation. Yet in the middle, we have these arrows going across, which is basically the destruction or the controlling cycle, which is just 2 cycles of energy, which if we studied physics at all, we know about cycles of energy and basically, waveforms being basically 2 poles. Similar principles are at play here as far as the dynamics in the controlling and destruction cycle. So now let's get a little bit deeper and understand the 5 elements in the next 5 minutes. So let's look at the controlling and destroying cycle first. And what does that mean to control or destroy? It's referring to, in the physical sense, the way in which all of our organs work together. Meaning there's a series of interrelationships between our organs. Because the metal element is associated with our lungs, our large intestine, and our skin. Which we might think, why would those be correlated at all? Well, one example is they all form out of the same fetal tissue. There's one correlation. We also look at the functionality of each of those 3 organs. What do they do? Well, the lungs, we basically inhale, air, oxygen, whatever, and then we eliminate waste, we eliminate, metabolic byproducts, toxins, etc. What does the large intestine do? It's the last place in our body where we can absorb nutrients and eliminate waste. What does our skin do? What most people don't realize is the skin is our largest organ, but it's also an organ of elimination and absorption. So whatever goes on our skin essentially goes right to our bloodstream. So in those simple ways, we can see some simple correlations, meaning the lungs are all about inhale, exhale, take in nourishment, eliminate waste. Large intestine, the same process. The skin, same process. And then even the psychological or the spiritual component is the same process. So the controlling and destroying cycle would be metal controls wood. What does that mean? Well, if you're going to chop down a tree, what are you going to use? Are you going to use water, or are you going to use fire? I mean, you could use fire, but it's not really chopping it down. If you're going to chop down a tree, you're going to need something that's been made out of metal. That makes sense. So next one would be wood controls earth. And has anyone ever tried to pull a tree out of the ground and notice how it's not easy? Trying to pull roots up out of the ground and realize that it's really hard. And if you do finally get it out, what's all over the roots? A bunch of earth. So we can see that wood controls earth. because tree roots basically spread out and really grab and take hold of the earth. And if we wanted to control soil erosion, what do a lot of people do? Well, they plant trees or they plant plants that are basically have a root system that spreads out and holds soil in place. So we can see, practical examples of how wood controls earth. Next example is earth controlling water. So if we were going to prepare for a flood, what are we going to put in front of our house? Sandbags. What is sand? Earth. So then we're using earth to control water. We all already knew that, but we didn't understand this sort of correlation. And then the last one, water controlling fire. I mean, if you want to put out fire, you're not going to use wood. You're not going to use metal. You're probably going to use water. Make sense? And then the last one, fire controlling metal. In that if you want to transform metal, you're not going to throw water on it. You're not going to throw wood on it. You're going to what? You're going to use fire. Because fire has the power or the energy to transform metal. So does that make sense? Because the 5 element stuff, I'm trying to just go through and give an introduction, because literally we could do a whole month on this stuff and still just barely scratch the surface, because the same principle we just illustrated, we could take and apply to our organs and our health, to our mind, to our emotions, to all different areas of life. So then now we'll look at the generation cycle, which is this cycle here on the outside. We just did the cycle on the inside, which is controlling. Now we'll do the cycle on the outside. Now the metal element in Chinese understanding is a little esoteric and a little harder to understand, because when we think of metal, we think of cars, we think of skyscrapers. But none of those things existed back when this philosophy was invented. To them, metal represents where heaven and earth meet. Sounds weird. Well, where does metal come from? It comes from space. Usually it comes from asteroids and things sort of crashing into the earth, and all these rare metals which essentially don't come from here. So they can say, oh, this is where heaven and earth meet. Well, we can see that literal example. And then the metal element is associated with the lungs. So they say, well, that's where heaven and earth meet. Well, where does the heavens come into our body? Through our lungs. Meaning the heavens not in our sort of Christian understanding, but in the kind of cosmic or Chinese sense of heavens being what's above us or what's invisible. Well, that comes and meets in our lungs. So it's kind of a little bit of how the metal element is different in our understanding and why some of this might seem a little bit odd. But if you were to trap water, you'd probably want to use metal, use a metal container. If you use wood, it's eventually going to decay. It's not really going to be good. You're not going to use earth. You're not going to use fire. So metal would make sense. And then also the sort of principle of water accumulating on metal naturally. Kind of like water accumulating on dew accumulating on your car first thing in the morning. So then water generating wood. We can see it here in this cycle, water generating wood. And really, without water, trees and plants can't grow. So that one is a little bit obvious. And if we throw too much water on it, then obviously the plant's going to drown. It's not going to survive. We don't give it enough, it's going to dry out. It's not really going to work. So that's a sort of simple way that we can see, water generates wood. Next one, wood generates fire. And obviously, you really can't have fire without wood. I mean, now we can because we have natural gas, we have all these logs, but to an ancient person, you can't have fire without wood. So they say, wood creates fire. And then they understand, well, if you have more wood, if you have better wood, then you'll have a better fire. So in a physical sense, the wood element is associated with the liver. And the fire element is associated with the heart. So to the Chinese, the liver creates or generates the heart. Meaning if your liver is better, your heart will be better. How does that make sense? Well, what does the liver do? Purifies blood, cleans our blood, stores our blood while we're sleeping, produces hormones, digests food, produces enzymes, all these important things. So if our liver is congested and stuck, we're going to have poor blood production. So then our heart's not going to have as much to pump. So then we can see, if the wood generates better blood, it provides better blood to the fire, and then the fire becomes stronger. Or the liver produces cleaner blood, the heart has more to pump, we have better circulation. Does that make sense? And then also we can look at sort of how the wood element connects to the liver. The liver is unique because it's the only organ that will keep regenerating. Meaning we can cut part of it out, it'll grow back. Cut part of it out, it'll grow back. No other organ in the body will really do that. Well, if we look at trees, we look at the wood element. What do? they basically keep growing until they die. So the liver does the same thing. So to the Taoists, they say, wow, that makes sense with this. Oh, okay. Also, trees can be sort of very controlling. Because we were talking about earlier how the roots in the trees were controlling the earth. Oftentimes, people get liver conditions. They get to be sort of control freaks. They sort of want to make sure everything is very this and that, and like really want to be up in everyone's business and make sure everyone's doing what they think they should do. And really just sort of controlling and sort of overstepping their boundary, just like a tree is very controlling and really growing past its boundaries and trying to control all of the earth that it can. So it's just one simple way that all of that can connect. Next is fire generates the earth, which we can see that after we have a fire, we have earth left over, we have ash. And that the bigger the fire we have, the more ash will be generated. So in a physical sense, the fire element is correlated with the heart, and the earth element is associated with our spleen and stomach and pancreas, or it's essentially our digestive system. So what does the earth do? It takes things in, it transforms them into nutrients. You know, like right now, all these leaves are falling on the ground, and it's breaking down and turning into fertilizer for further plants. What happens when we take in food? We take in food that is, you know, macronutrients, micronutrients. Our digestive system takes it in and eventually converts that to ATP. It's a similar process. And then the better blood circulation we have, meaning more fire we have, the stronger the fire, the better nutrient sort of assimilation we're going to get. Because it's great to eat a bunch of food, but if you have no blood circulation, how are those nutrients really getting dispersed throughout the body? So that's why we can say the bigger the fire, the more earth and ash will be generated. Because the more it's like, kind of like if you go out and get your heart rate going, you usually get really hungry afterwards. Well, why? Because that fire just generated a bunch of earth and just made you really hungry. So earth generates metal. This one makes a little bit of sense just because we want to find metal. We usually dig in the earth. We mine it out of the earth. We pull it out of the earth. So in this way, we can see that the earth or the spleen or stomach is generating the lungs or generating the metal element. So to recap, these 5 elements or these 5 phases, it's kind of like our periodic table of elements, wherein if we understand the building blocks, we can understand all different situations. If we understand the 5 elements, we can look at someone and say, oh, their liver has this, or their kidneys or that, without even really doing any further testing because we understand the 5 elements, and we're like Neo because we can just see in code. So it's a way in which these 5 elements are really fun and profound to work with. And to me, whenever I work with people on a one-on-one basis, like for consulting or whatever, this is primarily what I use, meaning someone might send me a paragraph saying what's going on with them, and I'll say, boom, 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 this is what's going on. And 9 times out of 10, it's exactly spot on because of this philosophy. Not because I'm at all smart or intelligent, but because this stuff is sound and these correlations pan out and tie together. So now everyone's favorite wu wei or action of no action, which we oftentimes think is being lazy or complacent or apathetic. When in reality, it's quite the opposite. So just as a survey, was that wu wei was in the text, wasn't it? Who here initially just thought it was like stupid or it was laziness or just like didn't really make any sense? Was that most people's interpretation, or did it just not really click? Well, what we'll do now is basically see what it's really all about and see how it's not about action or no action, but more so about becoming more of a human being or becoming more intelligent or really becoming more of our potential. So what I mean by that is getting out of our contrived mental world and back in touch with real reality. Because remember at the very beginning I said if we were to really talk about Taoism, we wouldn't say anything at all because Taoism is about felt experience. It's about real perception. And we saw earlier sort of the relativity of perception and how the actual symbol isn't the actual thing. So what would real reality be in this context? It would be more of our feeling state, more of our instinct and our intuition and our creativity and really our deep instinctual drives, which are most things that our culture just tries to push aside. We typically don't value these things, meaning as kids, we all have all these things and we're all just expressing it. But then at some point there comes an age where maybe we go to school or we get a job and they're like, well, you gotta leave that at home. You gotta leave that aside because it's not really useful anymore. And all our culture really values is knowledge about knowledge or words about words, which to the Taoist, it's more about getting out of the head and more into our heart and into our gut. And this might sound a little bit weird, but scientifically it makes sense. Number one, our heart emits a measurable electromagnetic field from anywhere from like 3 to 8 feet, depending on what study you read. Number two, our gut actually contains and produces most of our serotonin. Most of our neurotransmitters are produced here. And most people naturally get sort of gut feelings. Like you can walk into a room after people have been fighting and you're kind of like, so you feel something, or maybe you're hanging out with a friend and maybe you have all this animosity or this beef between you, and you feel this like tightness or tension in your solar plexus. We all sort of have that. We don't necessarily listen to it. We never had an educational system or a modality that said, here's how you listen to that, here's how you get in tune with it, here's how you use that. They told us, here's how you think, here's how you logic, but your heart and your gut, just leave that aside, you don't need it. But to me, as human beings, and to the Taoists, that's only 1/3 of who we are. So as human beings to the Taoists, we're not very intelligent, we're not very developed, because we're just focusing on one thing and ignoring the other two. So that's why to the Taoists, it's more about getting it out of the brain and back into the body, which is what we were talking about earlier with head knowledge versus body knowledge. Meaning if you memorize all the ins and outs of a block and you know exactly why it's good and who invented it and when they invented it, it doesn't help you if you can't actually block a punch. And if someone walks up and punches you in the face and you don't instinctively respond, it's not very helpful. So to the Taoists, that's why it's about being in the body or having body knowledge or body wisdom. It's kind of also like if you're trying to learn a dance move or you're trying to learn a piece on a music instrument, if you're thinking about it while you're trying to do it, you're not doing it. You're totally divorced from it. But when you get it to the place where you're in your body and you don't have to think about it, then you can achieve something, then you can do something. So that's a corollary to what the Taoist is really talking about. And why Wu Wei is so emphasized is because it's trying to counterbalance our overemphasis on the mind in contriving everything. And really, the mind is a great servant, but a terrible master. And we can understand this because the mind burns so much energy. I mean, think about it. If you're sitting in a class or you're maybe sitting at the computer doing mental work for a few hours, usually pretty tired afterwards. Yeah, there's people who can go out and run a marathon, and afterwards they're just walking around like everything is okay. So we can see that, well, the mind usually burns a tremendous amount of energy, especially if we're stressed or we're anxious or we're worrying about things, we're just burning even more energy. So this is where the aspects of Taoist meditation and health practices and martial arts all come into play because they help to retrain our nervous system to get us back into the heart, back into our gut, meaning they help to calm down the mind so we naturally feel better. In Tai Chi and meditation, all these things seem sort of esoteric, but in reality it's completely practical. And it just works through basically removing tension, kind of like if you had a garden hose and there's a knot in it. What's the quickest way to get better flow at the end? Well, obviously just take the knot out. But what most people do is go to the knob and crank it up and try to get it flowing more. That doesn't work. Call up the water company, yell at them, yell at the builders who put in the thing, and just blame everyone else down the line, rather than just saying, oh, let me just get this knot out. Which the equivalent would be doing Tai Chi or Qigong or meditation and smoothing the flow of the nervous system so that we naturally feel more relaxed and our mind naturally starts to calm down, which is one thing to talk about, but when you experience it, and we can all experience it because we're all human beings, but when you can get to that state, it's pretty crazy. Because we think, we look at wild animals, and if you ever walk in the woods, it's pretty rare that you'll actually see an animal. You might catch a young one, or you might catch a glimpse of one, but have you ever thought about, well, why don't you just see wild animals all the time? It's because they're in tune with their body, they're in tune with their environment, and they know where you are without even having to sit there and look at you. Whereas us, if we go out in the woods, we want to stalk an animal, we have to sit there and stare at it and pretend and just try to watch it, rather than just being in tune with our body and our instincts. So in many ways, these Taoist arts help us get back to being more sort of animalistic in a way, because they get us back to our body. Because again, our body is one with nature. Our body is what connects us to nature. Nature is what has the intelligence. So again, they help retrain our nervous system. Because again, remember our quote earlier, where there's blockage and stagnation, there's dis-ease. Where there's movement and free flow, there's health. I can guarantee you that if you did some of these exercises even for 5 minutes, your energy starts moving better, your blood moves better, you will feel at least 50% better like that. It's pretty profound. And then releasing stress and tension helps us feel more calm and peaceful, sort of in our mental state, but then also helps improve our health along the way. And this brings us to another important principle, in that the Taoist believes that the internal world is a reflection of the external world and vice versa. So what we think is that when we look out and see the world, what we see is the world. Like, you're looking at me and you think you're seeing me. But really all you're seeing is your interpretation, or what you're seeing is how your nervous system is feeling. If you're tired, then you're seeing a tired state. If you're energized, or maybe you just won the lottery, maybe you just fell in love, probably in a great mood. And we can understand that and just remember a time when maybe we were really stressed. Maybe we woke up and the day just, nothing really went our way. And everyone just seemed to get on our nerves. Maybe we got stuck in all the traffic and everything was just really annoying. It's not that the world was necessarily that. It's just that's a reflection of the state of our nervous system. Likewise, on the flip side, we could see a time maybe we were really happy and ecstatic. Maybe we just fell in love. Maybe we just won the lottery. Maybe we just got a really good grade on something. And we're like walking on air, and sort of, everything is going our way. And it's just sort of, not that the world necessarily changed, the people around us changed, it's just our state of our own nervous system changed. So taking that principle, Taoism wants to employ techniques that can calm our nervous system so that we naturally feel more calm and peaceful from the inside, so that when we look out on the external world, that's more of what we see. Which is pretty much what happens. And if you think, well, why do people really like drugs? Why do people really like catching buzzes on things? Because it takes their worldview and shifts it. Maybe they're having a terrible day, and now it's a good day. When really, in that 2-minute span, when those chemicals hit the bloodstream, what really changed? The world didn't change, their state changed. So that's kind of this major principle that Taoism is really all about, is changing our state from the inside out. Then we can change the external world, which again ties back into our story of the quintessential Taoist Master. He realizes that it's not about all of these external techniques and all these different modalities, whether it's herbalism or martial arts or medicine. It's more about him. It's more about his state and his state of working with these principles, because he understands the power of the simplicity. He understands that it might be useful to learn a bunch of stuff, but it's inherently worthless unless he can take that and translate that into something simple, which is actionable and tangible in the physical world. Which again is the same way if we can learn about blocking a punch, but if we can't actually block a punch reflexively, it's not really that worthful, or it's not really that useful. I think I just made up a new word, worthful. And then the last 4 concepts we looked at is the unity of man and nature, which leads us to understanding that the internal world is a reflection of the external and vice versa to the Taoist. And then finally, the 5 elements or 5 phases. And then lastly, Wu Wei, or the action of no action, which we understand now isn't really about being lazy or being passive, but tuning more into our full spectrum of intelligence and guidance. Meaning, we've all had an experience where we're trying to make a decision, and our mind says, you should really do this. Everyone's saying you should really do that. But our gut or something inside of us is saying, don't do that, go do this. But maybe we don't listen to ourselves, we go do the other thing, and it ends up being horrible, or being a whole ordeal. 9 times out of 10, that's what happens. I can tell you in my own life, I've had that happen a few times, and each time it's gotten increasingly more extreme, meaning the first few times it was just like a tap on the shoulder. Then the last time it was like a baseball bat to the head. And I was like, okay, I got the point. I'm going to listen to this. So that's kind of more of this thing about Wu Wei, or non-action. And that is the end. We all survived and we're all still awake. So yeah, hopefully that made some sense. It wasn't too weird.
Questions?